Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us at the Summit of the Future Debrief, hosted by Cepei and IISD. We're just going to give folks a few seconds to load in. Just to note that today's webinar is being recorded. So if you miss any because you have to step away or you've missed the first few seconds, of course, you can watch the recording and we encourage you to share that with colleagues. The chat should be open for everyone. We ask everyone to please keep a respectful, open mind in the spirit of multilateralism and the spirit of the Summit of the Future that we're going to be discussing. We're just going to wait for a few more seconds as people load in. Please, in the chat, if you'd like to introduce yourself, we're most glad to have you here today. It's my pleasure to introduce Philipp Schönrock, Director of Cepei, to get us underway. Thank you so much.
Wonderful, Matthew, and good morning to everyone from Bogota, Colombia. I want to welcome you from around the world to the Summit of the Future virtual debrief organized by Cepei and IISD. I'm Philipp Schönrock, and I'm the director of Cepei, and I will be moderating this morning our virtual debrief, and I'm very happy to get us started, and I'm pleased to give the floor for the opening remarks to my colleague Lynn Wagner, who is the Senior Director of Tracking Progress of IISD. Good morning, Lynn, and the floor is yours. Over to you.
Good morning, and thank you very much. And thank you all for joining us wherever you are. We are really excited to listen to our esteemed panelists. Thank them for sharing their insights, and really thank you all for joining us online. So heading into the Summit of the Future, my team and I were thinking about optimism. But was there any reason for it? Optimism for the summit, for the 2030 agenda, for the future? The headlines around the SDGs have not been encouraging. 17% of the targets are on track, which is not where we wanted to be at this point in the 2030 agenda. The progress has been moderate or minimal on nearly half the targets, and more than a third are stalled or regressing. So I'm not here to dismiss these headlines. They are true. The Pact, the Pact for the Future affirms we're off track. And its action items point to some missing elements that must be addressed if we're going to course correct. Peace and security and our international financial architecture holding a number of these flaws. So I don't want us to ignore those headlines, but I do want us to recognize that these headlines don't tell us the full story. The average trajectory of an SDG target may overall be negative, but that can hide some important progress that we have made. For example, SDG targets on health may be overall off track, but child mortality is reaching historic lows. So let's not ignore these wins of the past decade or fail to build on them as we address the targets where we are backsliding. In addition, there's some changing mindsets. When the SDGs were being negotiated, it was not clear that there would be an SDG with the word peace in it. During the negotiations of the SDGs, I remember one foreign minister coming and advising the negotiating committee not to attempt to include issues related to global peace and war, stating that that would risk derailing agreement on the other goals. 10 years later, here we are, there's clear recognition that progress on the other goals requires the global community to address these issues head on. 15 of the 56 actions identified in the Pact for the Future address international peace and security. And let's recognize how ambitious we are trying to be as we judge our progress. At the opening of the Summit of the Future, the UN Secretary-General said, "We are here to bring multilateralism back from the brink." That level of ambition might only be matched by the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs themselves. So should we aim for perfection? Yes. Should we fiercely hold leaders accountable to the pledges that they made in 2015 and earlier this week? Yes. And should we investigate where we fall short? Yes, but we cannot get discouraged when we fall short of the very highest goals or lower our ambitions, because that would erase the wins that many of you on this call have won in the past decade. So I'm hoping to have a wonderful conversation about those wins and where we need to move forward. And please use the chat. Really looking forward to our speakers. Thank you, Philip.
Thank you, Lynn, and we look forward to hearing from our true stellar speakers who have been not only within but in the negotiations and around them in order to get the Pact to the Future over the line. But before hearing from them, I will give over to my colleague Matt again, because we will do, as every year, a very small polling in order to get a sense of who is in the room and what the vibe is. So Matthew, over to you before we start our dialogue with our invited panelists.
Thank you so much. I believe you should be seeing a Mentimeter popping up in your chat window. This is a polling software taking you to our first question. What key issues discussed at the Summit of the Future resonated with you most? This is a word cloud question. I'm hearing information from the chat that this is not popping up yet.
Mass, at least for me, I'm not seeing still the Mentimeter here in the chat. If we could share it once again so that everyone has it.
My apologies, Philip. I'm trying again, but running into some difficulty. Perhaps we can return to these questions for our audience to reflect towards the end of the discussion and move right now into the panel discussion.
All right, well, sounds good. Sometimes we have technical problems if we talk about the Pact of the Future and the Digital Global Compact. It can happen. So Matt, please simply give us a sign when we can do the polling, and we will do it then at the end. And seeing this, I would like then to go directly into our conversation because, as Lynn already mentioned it, the Pact covers a broad range of themes, including peace and security, sustainable development and climate change, but also digital cooperation and important issues like human rights, gender, and youth. And this is why we have invited a selected member of experts in order to give us a sense what happened, what was negotiated, and what can we expect now in the future in order to see how we will implement in our countries and regions, and also at the global level, the Pact of the Future. Therefore, we have invited today Wangu Miwangi. She is the team leader of the Earth Negotiations Bulletin and has been covering the Summit of the Future. We have Carol Osero, who was not only the co-chair of the UN Civil Society Conference in support of the Summit of the Future, but she is also the Global Initiatives Lead and Africa Regional Representative of H, and a dear colleague to us as well. Carol, it's good to see you this morning as well with us. And last but certainly not least, it's Romeral Ortiz Quintilla, who works at the United Nations Youth Office as a program management officer and has also been in New York and is in New York organizing or was organizing the Action Days. So this is something for us to have in mind, that our speakers now will enter with me in a conversation first about the general themes and outcomes of the summit. And first of all, I would like to have a general sense of the three of you. What was agreed, what was important for you that was agreed, and first of all, was it a success in your eyes recognize what we achieved on Sunday, seeing world leaders having a new pact of the future. I can only say for those that didn't have the opportunity, it was a tense Sunday morning in the negotiation and General Assembly room. But I believe the nicest moment that we had in that morning was when we saw that we had a part of the future, and a general applause and cheers came out. And I have to reference one which I believed was a very nice moment because I had never seen it before. The President of the General Assembly thanking not only the co-facilitators, but their teams name by name because of their work in this facilitation. So Carol, over to you. I believe you have returned now from New York back to Nairobi, Kenya. And I would like to know from you, after a good morning, what was your general sense? What did we get done in New York at the Summit of the Future? What is your take of the major outcomes that we achieved? Over to you.
Thanks, Philip. And yes, I arrived this morning. I'm about 2 hours old in Nairobi. So I am just about to start fighting jet lag. But that said, it's good to be in this discussion, and especially coming soon after the summit. I think that is critical because many times we let these moments pass and we're not able to consolidate some of the issues that may not appear in the document. We're not able to tap into the nuances and some of the discussions that happened on the sidelines of conferences such as the Summit of the Future. So in terms of the outcomes, the fact that the pact was adopted was a good thing, because up to, I believe, Saturday night, there were still negotiations going on, and it wasn't clear whether it would be adopted. From where we sat, it was not clear whether it was going to be adopted or not. We may argue that the pact is not as strong as we had expected it might be, and that we also have other international instruments. We have the SDGs that are not fully implemented. We also have, with the human rights instruments, we have a lot of lack of implementation. And so we might argue that why are we focusing on a pact when we've got so much to do? But I think that the pact brings together certain elements. It is not perfect, but it does bring together certain elements that can help us turbocharge the SDGs, because that is what the ambition had been, and it should still be. It can also help us turbocharge some of the rights, the gaps in the implementation of human rights around the world. One of the things that was inspiring and for me life-giving was the fact that the pact was adopted together with the Global Digital Compact and the Declaration on Future Generations. Those are key because of the population profile that we have currently, but also the digital evolution. So we cannot take that for granted. And the fact that a lot of these issues are broken down in some of the action points, and I'm not going to go through all of
I don't know if it's me, but we have been losing Carol at this very moment. Carol, if you can hear us, you have frozen at this very moment. Carol, I would like not to cut you off, but if you could check your connection.
To pick out on a few from the pact is the fact that we can human rights, women's rights. Can you hear me?
Carol, we can hear you now. We lost you for around 30 seconds, and I was asking you if you could hear us. So if you could, for this first round, repeat where you were and that we could have a wrap up, that would be very helpful, because we lost you, like I said, for the last sentences that you were addressing to us.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. I could hear you all very well. But I was saying that I like the fact that the intersections are already beginning to emerge around critical issues such as gender, women and girls, and the youth. We see a thread across the three documents where the issues of women and youth, gender are brought in to the 5 chapters of the Pact and are reflected further on in the GDC and the Declaration on Future Generations. Those are critical because as we move along, we know about the population aging, and how the profile of the population will look like. So I'm glad that a lot of these issues are contained here. The Pact is very packed. PACKED, and it then behoves each one of us to unpack it and derive from it to take forward the work that we do. So to wrap up, I'll say that it was also a good opportunity for civil society to engage. We always push for more space, and that is not going to stop. But the fact that we were given opportunity through the major groups and other stakeholders and through other processes for civil society to bring the issues to the table, to the co-facilitators, including at the Nairobi conference, that is key, and that should also continue. So I'm going to stop there for now, Philip, and I'm happy to speak some more to these things.
Yes, Carol, thank you. And I will come back to you in a moment, but I would like actually to go now over to Wanru, since she is in New York, and only looking, Wanru, we have people truly from around the world, from the southern cone of the region where I am, from Chile and Brazil, Marruecos, India, Cameroon, Nigeria, Mauritius. I could go on and on in the list and show you a world map. And that actually reflects the interest in the Summit of the Future and their outcomes. You're still in New York, so please report for us live from New York. What is actually, after hearing from Carol, for you, the most interesting action and commitments that we got out of the Pact and that we now have to implement in our region and countries? It's a good morning to you as well, and the floor is yours, Wanru.
Thank you, Philip. And I think I would not want to take away from the amazing wrap up from my fellow countrywoman, Carol. Thank you so much. I think she has really encapsulated what happened in terms of the energy that was brought. And I think energy is the word that comes to mind, because not even at the UN General Assembly, because you cannot get in. It's really an access issue. It's very, very hard to come close to the decision-making platform in a sense. So for most of us, we observe, we are observers. I was an observer as a reporter, but I think to pick up from what Carol said, I think we saw a lot of energy, but coming from outside the rooms. And I think that's what pushes the process. I mean, we have someone from the Youth Action Days, they did such amazing, the protesters on the street, like, trying to say, look, what's happening in Palestine, you must not forget this. So I think for me, what I observed was a lot of energy coming from outside and sort of trying to get the world leaders to listen and like, okay, you're here, doing your usual business as usual every year, but what's going to change this year? And so the fact that indeed, after the scare on Sunday morning when Russia basically said they were going to reject the entire pact, and we have to respect sovereignty, and when sort of Congo for the African group said, no, we can't do that, this is our shared future and we must take responsibility. And then that was backed by the majority. That was an amazing moment for me. And I just thought, despite geopolitics, and everyone, the realists saying nothing is going to change, in the end, we have 5 countries that have veto power and nothing is going to change. But in the end, you do see still that people are saying, no, we can't allow things to stay the way they always have been. So again, I would agree with Carol. I don't think in terms of substance, then what we actually got in the pact is that, you know, impactful in terms of getting us to the next steps. But I think it's a reminder. It's a reminder that we have good commitments. We have this 2030 agenda. No, please, you know, we already have what it takes, what we need. You know, it's really what is lacking is still the political will and rebuilding that trust, you know, because it's really about rebuilding trust, they said from the beginning. You know, the multilateral system, people have lost trust in it. You know, it's not fair. Certain people have much more power than others. So let's just hunker down and just go with what we already have and just make that happen. And that's already good enough in a sense. So I think, to me, that's a message of the pact, you know, like, we don't need new major commitments. Let's just, you know, focus on what we already have agreed and make that happen.
Wandro, that's a first good introduction from New York on how you felt the vibes first during the negotiation and how you feeling it now that we came across the line. And I believe it is still not over. We're hearing still a lot from heads of state pushing forward, and some others that also have said that they do not agree. As you just mentioned, we had several countries that were still trying to push against the outcomes of this, but certainly one that was not pushing against it, but very much for it, was the youth engagement. We saw that this time around, during especially the action days, we had a lot of engagement from different stakeholders, and one stood out, which was the youth. They had a very prominent role both before and especially also in the morning of the negotiations ending of the Pact of the Future, with some very impactful messages coming from the youth. And who better here than Romeral to tell us what actually happened in New York, what was that engagement and what came out of it, because then I will turn more in the implementation phase to ask you about what comes next. But before, Romeral, the floor is yours. Tell us more what happened in New York, and especially around the engagement of youth and other stakeholders that was called Significant. Why?
Thank you, Philipp, and thank you, colleagues, for having me. So indeed, very much echoing what Carol and Wangu say about this energy outside the room. I think it came up very clearly on the Friday that started with the action days, with a dedicated half day on youth. And that was very special because this is one of the first time we see like that broader space really brought into youth perspective across the different pillars of the United Nations and of the Pact. So it was indeed very inspiring to see how young people really came together to shape the action day, to have that dedicated space, not only to talk about youth issues by young people, but really how young people perceive the different themes that are within the Pact for the Future, but also beyond. So there were different thematics that were approached from a youth lens, from humanitarian governance, intergenerational equity, climate, digital, gender, and others. And that was very important because for young people, they do want to discuss all these topics and really bring together different stakeholders. So it was also very empowering to see how young people came together to discuss those different topics as negotiations were happening, but also with different policymakers at the ministerial level and beyond, and other stakeholders as well. So that was quite a strong start for the action days that had this really principle of one, bringing different stakeholders together, as you were saying, and with the Youth Action Day really having this stronger focus on youth perspective and youth recommendation. But then also, as the name of the action days elude, the question of action. What do we need to have to actually now implement the Pact and really go beyond the text and make sure that we have an implementation, but also accountability system. So the Youth Action Day on the Friday really looked into unpacking some of those action, although we didn't know how the Pact would end up being on the Sunday. But taking as a foundation the version that was available at that moment, really unpacking the different actions, and then also seeing which are the commitments that are needed from member states and other stakeholders to really put that into practice and into implementation. So that was really at the core and the spirit of the Youth Action Day. And I think it brought really this important and very needed energy from young people, but also beyond and other stakeholders, to say that we are here watching you, seeing what negotiations are happening, and really bringing forward also conversations that are not directly reflected into the pact, but really making the case that young people do care deeply about all the matters that affect them, and that it's not only in chapter 4, which is on youth and future generation, which of course from the UN Youth Office we are particularly inspired to see that there is a dedicated chapter, but we also see youth mentioned across other chapters. And I think that was also a strong message from young people, saying that we do not only care, of course, about youth issues, but basically all matters are youth matters at the end of the day. So we see also very strong language around youth, peace and security in the chapter 2 around peace and security. So I think that was, again, a very strong foundation and message that kick out the whole action days, but also the summit of the future overall. So I stop here, but hopefully that gives us more into the conversation and see how young people perspective are absolutely essential when we talk about implementation of the Pact at this moment.
Romeral, they are vital, this conversation, to connect this to a more holistic conversation and stakeholder community. As you know, we need to talk about the implementation now, to what comes actually next. And how do we actually ensure the success of the implementation of the Pact of the Future's outcomes, and specifically how to connect the stakeholders from youth to elders, from Africa to Latin America and across the global South and North, in order to see what practical steps can actually emerge from the summit. And there is where my next question actually would like to go, which is what guidance can we give, and what ideas actually can we bring forward when we distill the Pact of the Future? There's a lot of in it, a lot that has to be implemented at the global scale, with the help of member states at the UN level, at headquarters and across the world. But there's also a responsibility from the different stakeholders. I would like first to go, where do we go next? What's the first step that we now, going back to capitals? We have just heard Carol coming back to Nairobi. She landed 2 hours ago. So before, Carol, you go into jet lag mode, what actually will be happening tomorrow when you go talk to your counterparts, to the line ministries, in order to implement the Pact of the Future? What comes next for you?
Thanks, Philip. And just riding on what Romeral and Wangu have said, we must carry the energy that we saw at the summit, especially from non-state actors, must be carried through in the post-summit period, because this is where the work actually begins. We were at a good party, and now we need to go back and start cleaning up and making sure that everything begins to work. But the other point that I want to make, the other general point, is reflected by Congo's, from the action on Sunday morning by the Congo. The issue is that the Pact belongs to all of us. And so if the SDGs are succeeding in one part of the world and not succeeding in another, then we're not going to get the development within the ambitions of the SDGs, our common agenda, and Agenda 2030. We're not going to get there. So we must begin to look at this thing, look at this issue from a perspective of the whole, and begin to say that, yes, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So how do we connect the parts? For me, that's a critical thing. How do we connect and work between civil society and the governments? There's a lot of work that goes on already. How do we strengthen that in a way that civil society still holds government accountable, and government does what it's supposed to do for its citizens? And how do we get civil society to collaborate more so that our efforts consolidate? We have to speak to the funders I don't know whether they were a critical part in the summit, but funders must stop funding piecemeal. They have to fund organizations that are working together so that we create greater impact on the ground. We must also begin to tap into the researchers, the think tanks, the academia, because they generate a lot of information. It is not always clear that this information gets to the databases of governments, or even that civil society can tap into that information so that their actions are data-driven and it's evidence-based as the civil society does its advocacy. So basically, one of the things that we proposed during the conference was impact coalitions. These were multi-stakeholder, civil society-hosted coalitions that would bring together government entities or member states, UN agencies, civil society, academia, think tanks, philanthropies, private sector, so that we work together towards a common agenda and consolidate our efforts, because we're working in very fractured ways. And then the final thing, Philip, that I want to say is that we must also begin to break the geographical divides. I touched on it when I started speaking. If we have a problem in New Zealand, it will affect the economy of Chile on the other end of the globe because of the geopolitics and the economics around it. So it's good that we then begin to have collaboration across the geographies, north, south, 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 because it's only then when our North Star as a people becomes one that will get our efforts together and aim for, we will refuse to accept mediocrity. Because right now we do accept mediocrity from our governments. When we pull together, our North Star will become clear, right? It's a little easy, and we will push for it as civil society, as citizens, as the people for whom this Summit of the Future was put up for, and for whom the Pact for the Future was adopted. So for me, the collaboration must begin in small ways and incrementally move to the regions and then globally. That would be my take for now.
The pact belongs to all of us, and I'm quoting you here, Carol, which actually reminds me that we have an invitation, maybe not formal, to be at the table. And I believe now we don't have to wait to bring the shares. We actually have to bring our own shares. And that's something we have heard in New York throughout the action days over and over again. So, Romeral, we also talk about connecting, we talk about implementation, and I want to stay here for a moment. Where do we go next? You mentioned, as you were wrapping up, it is not only about youth, it's about a holistic approach that includes a whole of society. How do we translate this into action?
Well, not an easy question, of course, but maybe to take a step back, also to mention that the UN Youth Office is a recent office that was recently established as per a General Assembly resolution, where member states basically saw the value and the opportunity to have a dedicated office on youth affairs within the UN Secretariat. So I think for us as the UN Youth Office, that also gives us a really good ground and foundation to keep the different commitments alive and make sure that we go into implementation, because we are being backed up by member states and by all member states of the United Nations that basically decided and approved the creation and establishment of our office. So in that same line, we saw the process of the Summit of the Future, of the Pact, and we are all results of our common agenda. So including the establishment of the UN Youth Office, the Summit, the Pact, and others are those recommendations coming from there. So I think we also need to align at that level and making sure that those commitments indeed go now into practice and into the implementation. And as a UN Youth Office, I do think we have a very unique opportunity to make sure that we align those different efforts and that we really unpack now all these actions that are within the Pact for the Future and ensure that we can track progress and ensure that it goes into implementation. So of course, as the UN Youth Office will remain completely available and ready to implement and support implementation of those actions. We already saw some of them that were addressed directly to the Secretary General, for instance, having some core principle on what meaningful youth participation means, which I think is something absolutely crucial if we want also to push into better inclusion and diversity into different stakeholder participation in decision-making and policy-making. So in that sense, I think there is also a unique opportunity to bring together and to connect the dots of different processes. And as you were mentioning, Philipp, to look at this, at the broader picture from really and seeing the synergies from the different processes that are coming. So we know the World Social Summit is coming up soon. From the youth perspective, we also have the ECOSOC Youth Forum happening every year, also looking into the implementation of the SDGs. So I think it's also now a moment, especially for us at the UN and at the UN Youth Office, to see how do we connect those dots and make sure that those efforts really complement and build upon each other, and that those are not siloed or like parallel processes that cannot speak to each other. So that's how I see also the implementation, where we need now also to process a little bit everything that happened. And I know for those of us that are or were in New York, it's so hectic that I do think we also need the time now to really go into unpacking, having a clear action plan and see how do we move forward and bring the different stakeholders together. And as you were saying, there are different levels of responsibilities and an accountability measure that needs to be put in place, but we are definitely committed to make sure that this is a multi-stakeholder process where everyone can find their role and space into the implementation phase of the Pact, but also beyond. And maybe just to end saying that, connecting to what I was saying before into the Youth Action Day in particular, young people also came together into an outcome document with very specific recommendation on how to move forward in terms of the actions and commitment within the Pact, but also beyond. So I think there is also responsibility to look into these different processes. And Carol was mentioning the Impact Coalition. A lot came up from out of Nairobi. So again, I think we need to make sure that we don't lose all those processes and all those recommendations that came up into the lead of the Summit of the Future. So that's what we have in our hands right now. And I think homework for all of us as well.
Well, you have a weekend ahead to rest, Romeral, and then on Monday, I think it started to work again, because there's a lot of things ahead. And what there is ahead is also to have a more concrete narrative when we go to the local and regional levels. And Wagner, we have just heard impact coalitions, global governance, digital cooperation, and we will go into future generations and the digital compact in a second. And we have heard about accountability. And we have just heard at this moment also on how we can create synergies with other frameworks. I will refer to those other frameworks in a second, because World Social Forum, the FFD4, or the Hamburg Sustainability Conferences are all places where we can actually not only have this debate, but we need to connect. But let's go first on the narrative, Wagner. You covered this, and you actually reported from New York and way before as well on the Summit of the Future. What's the narrative actually, and how can we translate now going from the implementation and taking it back to the local and regional levels? First of all, help us with the narrative. What do you believe it's the right narrative to bring back to the regions and to the countries? And then I would like to address a more general question to our panelists about the implications of the outcomes and how we can contextualize this at the regional and national level. But first of all, how can we translate this, Wagner, from your experiences now? Because all the word in slangs sounds too Carthaginian when we translate it into the real world. So we need policymakers to actually translate this into reality. Over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a big question, because I think ultimately what you see, the fact that these meetings are so packed and everybody wants to come, is partly a lack of translation, isn't it? I mean, people feel that if they're not there at the big event, then their voice is not going to be heard. So I think there is definitely a big issue of who are the gatekeepers, who is the person that brings these messages back. And clearly there's again, we talked about trust. So it's not just about the sort of the governance like the General Assembly, but also somebody posed a question within the chat about civil society. Is civil society also organized? I mean, these are questions, profound questions for every section, every stakeholder. So I don't have an easy answer to that, because I think it's also about taking responsibility, you know, from wherever you are. If you are attending these events, that then you do report back to your constituency, but there can never be one whole tent where everybody gets informed at the same time. So like the youth, you know, it's about going through your constituencies, the women's organizations. And I think that is happening. I mean, to be fair, I think people are trying much more to connect, you know, and to have one voice. I think just in terms of a practical next step, because again, sadly, we are so focused on the global events. I mean, now we have the series of COPs that are starting. So we're going to have the climate conference, and we're going to have the biodiversity conference, and we're going to have the one that everybody forgets, the desertification conference. So because those are the three like environmental agreements, just as an example. And again, what we have at those conferences, we have what we call the Rio Conventions Pavilion, and that's sort of the tent that tries to bring then the actors from across these different spaces. So I think one practical step is actually organizing around the COPs, you know, that are coming up, because a lot of energy is going to that. And even as we are leaving New York, people are already organizing for climate, and they have been. So again, why not maintain this momentum through the next, you know, series of UN conferences that are coming up, because it will be the same people you meet on the plane and in the hotel and, you know, in those tents. And so that's my practical suggestion. But I don't think we will ever have one translation mechanism that gets a message right from the top to the ground. It's the individual combined efforts of many people, but I think purposely trying to connect at that level of the mediators themselves, you know, and just making sure that they're on message, you know, they're bringing the same message to others. I don't know if I answered the question, but yeah, that's my take.
I know it was a big one, and we will have more to come in the next months about this. But I also wanted to see, and we will have some questions also from the audience, since time it's of course running short. But I wanted to make sure, Carol and also other colleagues here on the line, about the implications of the outcomes, because we asked about what was your perspective about the success, what was your perspective about the agreed priorities that we had. But now that we have to take it back to the regions, I wanted to ask you also about how this can be translated into a reality. Carol, you just mentioned civil society more than once, because you were leading and co-chairing the civil society conference. What actually comes next? Do we need more conferences? Do we need to bring it down to smaller groups and actually see how we can influence policy now? What is the strategy for bringing it back, in your case, very specifically to Africa, but across regions? What's your take? You're still on mute, Carol.
Okay, yeah. Thanks. I noticed my computer is about to die. I've got 4 minutes remaining. I'll try and join in on another machine. But before it dies, just to say quickly, I do agree with Wango. We cannot have one monolithic structure for civil society. It's not even practical. But we have to find ways of linking the different things that we do, and that's where the multi-stakeholder coalitions come in. So for example, I work on aging, and my funders think aging, but nothing prevents me from speaking to issues of climate change, sustainable development, because older people will be beneficiaries of those processes. So we have to start rethink how we program our work, separate from the funding structures that we have. But in practical terms, some of the things that we're doing, we are bringing the Pact home. In Kenya, we will have a meeting with several UN agencies in October already to bring the Pact home, because there are very few Kenyans in New York. The ones who remained home need to know about it. We also want to do this from a regional.
I think she mentioned that her computer was about to die, and it just happened. But I wrote down, we have to bring the Pact home. And I liked actually that note. And bringing the Pact home, I would like to open up for the two of you at this very moment, Wangru and Romeral, 2 questions from the floor, because then we will end up in looking on how and what synergies can we have with other frameworks. I just mentioned the World Social Forum, but also the FFD discussions that we are having and have to wrap up by June in Seville in Spain, and others that are actually upcoming in the next couple of weeks on how we can bring actually the discussion back home to our regions. But let me see, I have 2 persons up with their hands right now, 4 questions. So I see Marlana Strandford and Chandra Chekarv, sorry for my very bad pronunciations of your name, and Sophie Rick, I remember that name as well. So for the 3 of you, please, with 1 minute, the intervention, if it's a comment or a question, because we do want to get some of the vibe that it's in the room right now and have your questions in the floor. So Marlana, if you can hear us, please address the floor right now. You have a minute, the floor is yours.
Yes, hi, my name is Marlena Strinford. I'm from American University in UP's Costa Rica. It is a great, with great gratitude that I was able to participate in the ISCD conference as a feature researcher. I do want to congratulate my fellow participant and also all the guest speakers for hosting this summit, that we as a collective people are able to present our solutions that improves the future, that technology innovation and also our ideas and solutions are creating a better world for our future generations. And so thank you for hosting this event. I look forward to networking with everyone and hoping to continue these efforts. Thank you.
Thank you. So I will go right away to Sandra, please. Sandra, if you can hear us.
Yeah, are you hearing me?
Yes, please. The floor is yours the next minute.
Thanks a lot. Actually, I had been listening to our learned panelists, Romeral, Wanggu, and Carol, and of course, the very good moderator, Mr. Philipp. I must say that for the implementation of the SDG in the summit, whatever has happened, and the call of, I think, the signal given by Secretary-General of United Nations for making National Youth Council is a very right step. And it's a very good initiative being taken by Romeral Ortiz. I must say that connection of youth is very important these days because they are very much dedicated and concerned about our future. And I must say that I am actually an Indian Forest Service officer who was involved in conservation of nature. And I'm in Himachal Pradesh, India. I must say that I am already very much impressed with IISD's initiative, and it's a very good initiative, today's webinar. And thanks a lot, and must give some examples and some strategy for particularly the women and child in the society, in the remote area and the poverty-ridden area, how to help them, not only in Asia, all world over. Thanks a lot, Mr. Philipp.
No, I thank you, Chandra, and I cannot be more happy to know that we are truly reaching out through all regions of the world, and that we can share the lessons learned and the outcomes from the Pact also to you, Chandra. So we have Sophie to wrap up the round of comments and questions. We have one which is very pertinent also about the effects of the acceleration of the SDGs through the Pact of the Future. And our colleague Marianne Beisheim has mentioned where this actually was mentioned. I will put it also in the chat and copying only her words in order to have the answer on how this is related to the SDGs. But I go back now to Sophie. Good morning to you. It is good to, I hope, hear and see you.
Hi, good morning. I hope you can hear me all right. Yes, great. So my name is Sophie Rigg. I work with the Global Network for Disaster Reduction, and I'm based here in New York. And thank you very much for this really interesting discussion. And I really value your insights, and great to see you again, Philipp. It's been a while since our time at GPSTD together. I just have a question for the panelists around the emergency platform. I'm sort of struggling to fully understand why it didn't go ahead in the Pact and some of the politics potentially around that. I mean, there are issues around sovereignty and issues around duplication across UN agencies, but I'm interested to hear if anyone has any further insights on the emergency platforms in particular. Thank you.
Thanks, Sophie. And as I'm seeing that more hands are coming up, I would like first, we had several comments, but also some questions like Sophie about the emergency platform. If you can take those, Romeral and Wangu, I believe Carol has just joined us, and then we will go to the last section in order to wrap up on time. We have several questions that I will try to also summarize. Unfortunately, there are too many.
Unfortunately, Philipp's computer seems to have paused a bit. So Romeral, and perhaps we'll start with you and then go to Wangu on a question about emergency platforms. The question was posed by Sophie Rigg, if you have any insights there to share.
Thank you. Happy to briefly comment, sorry, noting that I won't be the person or the expert to actually comment on that, but more from maybe the youth perspective. I think what's interesting, also considering what's within or what was left outside the Pact for the Future, is really to take the Pact for the Future as a foundation, also to go beyond. So as I was referring, for instance, young people have been very vocal on how there is the need for platforms such as the emergency platform and others to really build and being able to respond to emerging crises and others. So I think there is also the need now to take the Pact as this foundation, but also to look into other commitments or needs or recommendations that come from different stakeholders, including from young people who have been very vocal around those issues, and see how we bring those together to really reinforce the Pact even beyond what's in the actual action. So that's what I would say, but I don't have more insights into the emergency platform in particular, as I'm not the expert on that, but I don't know, perhaps Wangu colleagues will be able to give more information. Thank you.
No, just a quick answer is I'm also not the expert on the emergency platform, but I think it's like many other specific, like initiatives. I think there was a hesitance, to commit. So I would just say in a generic way, I think it's hard in this kind of document to be that specific.
Okay.
Yeah, I think Romeral and Wangu have said it. So let's not belabor the point. So back to you, Philipp.
Well, I'm back. I'm very sorry that the moderator had some connection problems as well. That happens sometimes, especially when you're moderating. But I wanted to actually, if I heard you correctly, you were able to react to the questions and comments. And since time is running out, Matt, if we are actually on for our poll before we end, please give me a sign. But before doing so, I wanted to end end up about the synergies with other frameworks. How does actually the Pact of the Future have an impact on the environmental cooperation? How does it actually refer to the digital world that we are just getting a comment right now, which is a big part and an important one, which is the Global Digital Compact? And how do we actually connect it to other frameworks? We have people with a lot of experience in this call about the World Social Summit that we're gearing up towards next year in November that we already mentioned. So how can we create that synergies and in order to reinforce actually the implementation of the Pact of the Future? So over to you, first of all. Now in the adverse order, Wagner, please start if you have any idea, Urameral, and then Carol, and then I give the floor back to my colleague Mas in order to close this webinar. Please, over to you, Wagner.
Yeah, thank you. I think just already what I said before, I think it's just working organically and cumulatively towards, like the next big moments. And I think the financing for development conference coming up obviously is a really big one. So yeah, no specific answer. I would just say people just have to maintain momentum and keep pushing through the different opportunities that are coming up. But I think also, as we've said, like not working within your own, silo, but really trying to look at value added in terms of, so if it's just climate financing, not just pushing for climate finance for climate, projects, but really looking at the underlying drivers and how to connect those. I think that's how you get really the value out of the resources that we have.
Philip, maybe what I can add to what Romrol has said is, again, going back to the issue of intersections, increasingly look at how climate action, climate change intersects with everything that we do. And when we do that, we will find that the intersections are very many, and we can then organize ourselves. But I think the other thing is also to increasingly create platforms for engagement. We cannot create that mega structure, but if we find we have opportunities where we can exchange ideas or even engage with each other, it would be very helpful. And then finally, to tap into the digital space, and someone mentioned it on the chat, increasingly use webinars to bring some of these issues to the local level, to the regional, and even the global levels. Is nothing that prevents us from having some of these meetings virtually. So I hope I'm not speaking out of turn. I dropped off a little bit as I was trying to connect to my phone, but I think that would be still useful.
It was very much and to the point where we were going to, Carol, and the connection problems looks like it was our tedious moment for all of us today. But going now to the end of it, since it is in my clock here in Bogota, Colombia, 8:59, and then 1 minute we are closing. First of all, I wanted to give once again thanks not only to our panelists, but also to you that connected over 400 people in the morning hours, late hours from around the globe in order to join us and give us the opportunity to share what came out of the Pact of the Future. I would like also to thank the persons behind this, not only Lynn, who has always been a strong supporter for IISD, but also their dear colleagues Eleanor and Matthew, who have helped us actually to be here and to make this possible, and my own colleague Alexandra. For them, it's a big thank you. It's early in the morning. You started even earlier than all of us in order to make this happen. So Matthew, before saying goodbye to our participants, can I hand over to you and know that you will now close up with the Mentimeter or send it online? I just want to make sure before saying goodbye to everyone.
Thank you so much, Philip. The usual integration of Mentimeter Live is not working right now, but I have dropped the link into the chat, and we are very curious to know your feedback. So please, if you look in the chat window at a comment made by IISD, you should see a link to menti.com, and it gives you an opportunity to answer 4 questions. 4 questions about what were the key issues at the Summit of the Future that resonated with you most, whether or not you think the Summit of the Future impacts your work going forward in the Pact of the Future. So we look forward to sharing the results with you of those questions. As we share the recording, an email will be sent to everybody who registered for this, and of course we'll share on social media the recording of this webinar. We thank you for sharing it with your colleagues. And thank you again on behalf of ISD to our panelists for your insights, and Philipp for, as always, your exemplary moderation of the conversation. We deeply appreciate it. Thank you, everyone. And wherever you are in the world, please have the very best day.